Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. President Biden marked his first Veterans Day in office with a salute to the troops that he called the solid steel spine of the country. It's the first Veterans Day in 20 years without U.S. troops engaged in an active war overseas. President Biden laid a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier this afternoon, and he spoke about the sacrifice that few Americans make.
It's an honor that not only a small percentage of Americans can claim, and one that marks those who are able to claim it as brothers and sisters. It's a badge of courage that unites across all ages, regardless of background, because to be a veteran is to have endured and survived challenges most Americans will never know.
Veterans Day comes as the White House is gearing up for a bill signing on Monday. A bipartisan group of lawmakers, mayors, and governors will gather for President Biden's signing of a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. The White House has been forced to confront inflation as the prices of everything from groceries to gasoline are on the rise. Until this week, President Biden had been touting the country's pandemic economic recovery. Now he says he's dealing with inflation as a top priority. Plus, former President Trump is attempting for the fourth time to block the House Capitol Riot Committee from obtaining records related to January 6th. Mr. Trump's attorneys are asking a D.C. District Court for a temporary administrative injunction. The committee is also expanding their subpoena list once again. They're now reaching into the circle of former Vice President Pence. For more, let's bring in Weijia Jiang, Chris Cadelago, and Franco Ordoñez. Weijia is CBS News' senior White House correspondent. Chris is a White House correspondent for Politico, and Franco is a White House correspondent for NPR. Welcome. It's good to talk to all of you. Franco, let me start with you. How serious is the threat of inflation to the president's social and climate spending package?
Oh, I mean, I think it's a very big deal. I mean, this is obviously something that he is going to be very focused on before the midterm elections. Now, the president will say, he has said that his Build Back Better plan, his domestic spending plan, particularly his infrastructure plan, will help with inflation, that it will kind of push down some of the prices that we have seen creeping up, as you pointed out, at the grocery store and at the gas pump. But, you know, it's going to take some time until those measures really have an impact. And he needs some difference right now, as Republicans are already attacking him for the spending and blaming him, right or wrong, for the increase in numbers. And they're going to use this increasingly as we get closer and closer to the midterms. President Biden does have, Nobel laureates and economists who are behind him and saying his plan will help. But at the end of the day, people are thinking about right now and what is their milk prices? What is their gas prices? And that is going to have a real impact on how people are feeling about President Biden over the course of the next few months.
And Weijia, we know the support of Senator Joe Manchin will again be critical in passing a social spending bill. The senator is now expressing concerns about inflation. Has he been in recent contact with the White House on this?
I don't think the White House has ever stopped contacting Joe Manchin. The question is whether the president has personally engaged and picked up the phone and tried to call who he considers a friend. And I'm sure that's happened, but we don't have any specific details about such phone call, at least in the past few days. But what's important here, Elaine, is that Senator Manchin not only expressed concerns about inflation yesterday after that grim figure came out that showed the increase was, a record setter for the past several decades, but he had already been talking about fears of inflation as one reason why he was so hesitant to sign on to the president's social spending package. And so the timing really couldn't be worse for the numbers to come out to show that, in fact, they are worsening. And as Franco was mentioning, there is no immediate relief, because even if the infrastructure package will ultimately help with the supply chain, to help with those bottlenecks projects. People want relief now, and those projects are going to take time. And one thing that the White House has struggled with is to offer any specifics about what projects are going to be shovel-ready in the next coming months, what ports are going to be directly impacted, how this money is going to be used to make everyday lives better in the coming weeks and months as people especially start looking to the holidays. So with regard to Joe Manchin, yes, it is a continuous problem made only worse, I think, by this latest report.
Well, in fact, Chris, you write that President Biden is in a, quote, politically perilous limbo as he focuses on economic growth while Americans are seeing those higher prices of goods. How is the White House trying to balance those issues?
Yeah, part of what we saw last week with the elections in Virginia and to a degree New Jersey and also in other states was this idea that many Americans, a large solid majority of Americans, feel like the country is off on the wrong track. Like the progress that we've made so far, whether it's adding jobs, whether it's the increase in wages, have not trickled down to the level that folks feel like things are getting better. Obviously, vaccines have picked up, but many people are still not back in their workplace. They're still feeling sort of like they did during sort of the height of the pandemic. And that's the real challenge for the White House. We saw when the jobs numbers came out at the end of last week, there was a certain degree of trumpeting of those numbers. But the cautious note that they've sounded and what we've seen from the president all week this week at several different events was this acknowledgement that he knows prices are going up. He knows gas prices are going up, prices on groceries, and that the people have to feel like this recovery is affecting them both to improve his own standing, but also to improve the standing of all Democrats. And I think, as Franco mentioned, one of the big ways in which they're doing that is pointing to the bipartisan infrastructure bill that passed, but also the Build Back Better agenda and the need to pass that, pointing to the 17 Nobel laureates who said that instead of increasing inflation, this would actually ease it. That's the White House's argument. So it's this cautious kind of step that they're taking to tell people things are getting better. We know that you may not feel it entirely right now, but hang with us, and the recovery will continue.
And Weijia, next week really will be Infrastructure Week, at least Infrastructure Day on Monday. President Biden is holding a signing ceremony for the infrastructure bill on Monday. What is the president doing between now and then?
So you know that tomorrow he is meeting with his cabinet to talk about the implementation of the infrastructure bill, because, again, one thing that is still unclear is how this huge amount of money is going to be distributed. We know that for the broadband piece, for example, every state is going to get at least $100 million, and then the rest of it will be divvied up based on need. But for other projects, for roads, bridges, tunnels, things that need to be fixed, it is going to be linked to specific departments, but we don't know, the funneling of that money and whether it will all go directly to states first, what kind of federal oversight there will be. So they'll be talking about that. And then the president will spend the weekend at Camp David, which he often does for a working weekend before that signing ceremony on Monday, which is significant because I think the president really wants to show a victory, which is exactly why he decided to wait until those lawmakers were back in town, because he wants everybody in the same room. It not only shows that he got the deal done, but he got it done with Republicans and Democrats, which is something that he ran on, being this great negotiator with his experience from the Senate. And so I think, this is going to be a ceremonial day for the president, because certainly it is a big day in his presidency.
Well, Chris, also set for Monday is a virtual summit between President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping. What are they expected to discuss?
Well, this is something that a lot of people have been looking toward. It's a very important virtual summit, virtual because President Xi has said that he will only be doing virtual ones, and the White House has taken that and understood that and talked about this coming before the end of the year. They've also sought to, lower expectations talk about trying to get back on the right footing after a series of conversations involving administration officials and Chinese officials over this year that certainly did not go well. In terms of deliverables, they're not looking at too many, but it's really this opportunity to reset the bilateral relationship. There are some sort of what you can look at as smaller bore items in terms of easing visa restrictions, looking at possible framework on trade frictions, just ways to demonstrate that the relationship can hold together. The U.S. obviously concerned in this of not looking like it's backing down or looking weak, and those are going to be some concerns for Biden in this as well.
All right. Well, Weijia, the Biden administration announced today that it is investing another $785 million in communities hit hard by COVID-19. What will that funding go toward?
Well, ever since the president took office, he has really stressed this idea of equity among communities and making sure that everybody, regardless of their socioeconomic background, has access to the same tools to fight the pandemic. And so most of this money is going to underserved community. For example, $240 million to expand the workforce in community healthcare programs by creating pipelines for thousands of additional healthcare workers. There will be a huge tranche of money for tribal communities to make sure nurses and schools are trained and have the resources that they need as the administration tries to vaccinate more children. There will be money dedicated for people who have disabilities, who have different health needs compared to those who do not. So I think that this is just another example of the administration trying to reach out to those people who are underserved to try to give them what they need for ultimately their end goal to get more people vaccinated, which is still a struggle because, things have pretty much plateaued when it comes to first shots, and they're really trying to ramp those numbers up.
Switching gears, Franco, Ned Ryan, an ally of former President Trump, is saying, get ready for Trump 2024. What about where the political and economic climate is heading could set him up for a successful run?
I mean, I think having covered former President Trump for 4 years, it is a very interesting subject, and it is a very interesting concept to think about the possibility of him running again. I mean, look, he's acting like he's going to run. He's out fundraising. He's out having a lot of media interviews. He is definitely teasing that possibility repeatedly. I mean, his super PAC has raised a good chunk of money. He's had fundraisers at his golf courses. He's traveled for rallies in Iowa, and a lot of his supporters, not only Ned but others, have spoken out expecting that he will run. And look, having covered him for so long, it is hard for me to imagine him not being attracted to that possibility if he still controls or has the type of power that he has over the Republican Party that he does now. And it is very clear that he still controls a lot of the emotions and fears of many in the Republican establishment and, in the Republican base. So I think he has said or indicated that he's going to wait until the midterms. And I think a lot of people will be watching how the Trump candidates or so-called Trump candidates do in the midterm elections as another indicator of what, his future entails.
Well, into that mix, you have what appears to be a preemptive jab from the former governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, on an upcoming episode of Axios on HBO. He said this about President Trump for losing re-election. Let's listen.
I'm not going to get into a back and forth with Donald Trump, but what I will say is this. When I ran for re-election in 2013, I got 60% of the vote. When he ran for re-election, he lost to Joe Biden. I'm happy to have that comparison stand up because that's the one that really matters.
Okay, Chris Cadelago, what is the back and forth that led to that comment?
So it's very interesting seeing someone come at Donald Trump, have Donald Trump come back at them and say something, as he often does, whether it's about the Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell or someone else in the party, the folks who voted to impeach him, the folks who are voting for Joe Biden's agenda, and for them to then come back again and issue another shot, which is what Chris Christie did there, noting that he won his reelection handily and Donald Trump lost his to Joe Biden. But I think you have to look at this from Chris Christie's perspective. Chris Christie has spent a lot of time over the last several months, someone who came out and endorsed Donald Trump early in that primary, someone who said a lot of things in defense of Donald Trump over the course of his presidency. He's looking at sort of what you might call a rehab of his own image, of his own political brand. Obviously, he's a commentator on TV, and I think one of the ways in which he does that is to not back down from Trump, to see how much allegiance there is within the Republican Party, within that primary electorate for Trump. Obviously, Trump still has a majority support among those Republicans, but when you go and you ask them whether he should run again, that number certainly drops. And I think there are other folks who are playing their cards close to the vest, some saying that they would suggest they would not get in the race, not get in the primary if Donald Trump is to run again. And then there are others who would probably run regardless. And I think for Chris Christie, part of this is the public image rehab. Part of it is testing the waters. Part of it is seeing whether the support within the Republican electorate is softer for Trump than Republicans currently indicate. Clearly, a lot of them are going to say they support him. Whether they actually want him to mount another challenge, whether they think he could win again, if it is indeed a rematch with Joe Biden, that's to sort of a TBD. But I think Chris Christie has positioned himself in this lane as kind of a alternative to Donald Trump, someone who's presenting sort of a forceful image. We saw in the Virginia election, education being a big issue. You go back to Chris Christie's tenure in New Jersey, and of course, he took on the teachers union. That's an issue that he raised early on. And so I think we will see what happens with it, but he sees an advantage in going to the media and punching back at Trump, which we have not seen among high-ranking figures and well-known figures within the party in quite a while.
Yeah, it's certainly a dynamic many people will continue to watch closely. Weijia Jiang, Chris Cadelago, and Franco Ordoñez, great to have you all. Thank you very much.